So now the recording, I started the recording and say again a warm welcome, and I will give the piece to Nancy, who will lead us through the check-in. I hope I didn't forget anything, Nancy. Please, can you help me?
Thank you, Rolf. No, I don't think you forgot anything, perhaps just the camera. Again, if you move your mouse around, if you scroll around, you will also activate the camera in the bottom left-hand corner, and it would be wonderful to be able to see everybody that's there. So you don't need to mute the camera at any point unless we just end up taking too much space with the cameras, but we would love to see people on the screen. So please activate your cameras, and then, as Rolf said, remember to unmute when you want to speak. Now, we are so pleased to see this many people on this call. Let's see, how many are you here? 1, 2, 12, 10, 11, 12, 15 people, 15 guests with the 4 of us. That's wonderful. And it's going to mean that our check-in is going to be shorter than what we had anticipated. So but we would love to hear from everybody, because your word matters here. We are here for you. So if we could simply just go around and hear from everybody your name and where you're sitting. So who are you and where are you tonight as we all join this webinar? And since I have the talking piece now, I will say, so I'm Nancy, and I am sitting in Paris and looking out, in fact, over a sunny Paris. And the piece is in the middle for everyone to say who you are and where you're sitting tonight.
This is Eliana Brado. I'm sitting in Vancouver, BC, Canada.
Hi,
My name.
Oh, hello. Hi, that's Julie Deline, and I'm sitting in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Sunny and warm. After 2 weeks ago, we had full, like, 2 feet of snow.
My name is Mary, and I'm in Toulouse in France. And it's cold outside, but sunny, not tonight, but during the day.
Hi, I'm Lan from Paris.
Hello, my name is Jane. I'm sitting in Morges in Switzerland.
Hello. Can you hear me okay? Hi, I'm Janice, and I am here in Vancouver, British Columbia. Learned a lot from Kathy and Gary at Art of Hosting, and excited to learn more about how Worldview Intelligence might help some conversations about risk and uncertainty in the mining industry. So happy to join you. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Tina, and I'm between Bonn and Cologne in Germany.
Hi, I'm Val. Do you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm Val, and I'm sitting just outside Vienna, which is basically in the middle of Europe somehow. And I attended the Worldview Intelligence training over 1.5 years ago, and I was so much looking forward to reconnecting. So nice to see also so many old and new faces.
Hello, I'm Karen Densmore, and I'm connecting in from Halifax, where we have a beautiful sunny day today.
Hello, I'm Annie, and I'm sitting in Lyon, in France.
Hi, my name is Rosa, and I am in rural New England in the Berkshires, and I'm a huge fan of Kathy's writing, and I have not had the opportunity to take the Worldview or the Worldview Intelligence workshop yet. So I'm really interested to be here.
Yes, I'm Rolf. I'm sitting now here in my house close to Cologne. It's called the Bergisches Land. We had a sunny day, and I'm happy about the spring. And I attended also the first Worldview Intelligence workshop in Europe 1.5 years ago.
Well, you organized it, huh?
Yes.
Which was great. Thank you still for that.
Thank you.
I'm Pam, and I'm sitting on a bus in St. Paul, Minnesota.
And I'm Julie, and I'm in Redwood Falls, Minnesota.
I think you could begin, Kathy.
Who are you?
I'm Jerry. I'm in Minnesota, northwest corner, out in the countryside.
Excellent. Thank you. I just, as everybody was introducing themselves, I just felt my heart growing bigger and bigger and bigger, and I was very excited to be here talking about something that is near and dear to our hearts. So I'm going to try to share my screen here with you. There. Is that it?
Yes.
Okay. So this is something that Jerry and I can talk about for days on end. And so we're going to try to contain it within a few short minutes with all of you. We've done our welcome. We're going to illustrate worldviews in action in just a moment, talk a little bit about what is a worldview, follow some behavioral science work and why that's relevant to what we're doing, introduce the framework that we've been working with, do some very brief descriptions of some of the ways that we've been applying worldview with the client work that we've been doing, and talk a little bit about the one-day offerings that we are coming to Europe for in a very short time from now. And then a wrap up. We will pause in between time for any questions that you might have, and please write your questions in the chat box as well. And I am also sitting in Halifax along with Karen, not with her, but in the same location, and it is a beautiful spring day outside, which is where I will be going when we are finished this webinar.
Great.
Sorry, did you want to say something?
Yes, I was going to introduce what's coming. Are you finished, Kathy?
Oh, yes, go. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Welcome, everyone. Delighted to see so many join us on this call, this webinar. We're going to show you 4 pictures. We're going to show them fairly quickly, and we invite you just to think of your reaction to each picture, and then we will come back and see them again. So just check your reaction. First picture, Kathy. Next picture. Picture. Final picture. And then the next slide, please. So in essence, what you just experienced was your worldviews at work as you looked at the pictures and had a reaction to them. So some of you that are familiar with systems thinking, if you look at the ladder of inference, at the bottom is something that we see, some information presented to us. As we climb the ladder, we interpret that information, draw a conclusion about it, react to it, and decide to act. What's interesting here is research that's been done at MIT in Boston is that from the moment you see something to the moment you make a decision to act is 13 milliseconds. That's faster than the blink of an eye. That's our worldviews at work, seeing, interpreting, and deciding what action to take in 13 milliseconds. The importance of this is, and why Worldview Intelligence is important, is for us to understand where that interpretation came from that we reacted so quickly to. This is why the work of Cambridge Analytics, for those of you that follow it, is so important. They want to know in advance as much about you as possible because you are going to respond this rapidly to whatever information someone presents to you, whether it's an advertisement or a political message or some other message. So let's come back to the pictures. First picture. So in the interest of time, we won't go through a big conversation, but there's that picture again. Remember what your reaction is, and here's what was really happening. Is the students were in the museum and they were using an interactive app to learn about the painting. So they weren't all on their cell phones ignoring the beautiful painting in the background, as many people often react to. Next picture, please. So here's a mother in the airport. You can see the woman to our right on the picture looking at the baby with not such kind face. Here's what's really going on. The woman has been traveling for almost 20 hours, dealing with delays, and she's trying to reach her family with an update of where she is. The baby is safely on the floor. Those of us that have had children know that babies crawl around on the floor all of the time. But when this picture went out on social media, the reaction was very negative, and this woman was criticized extensively for being a bad mother. Next picture. And here's the reality of the picture. This is a women's hockey team from Edmonton, California, and the picture was taken in 1916. Yeah, Canada, sorry. Before the symbol of the swastika was appropriated in World War II by the Nazis, it was seen as a symbol of good luck and success. And throughout the United States and Canada, you could actually have businesses with names like Swastika Bakery or Swastika Hardware Store. And in fact, the symbol is something that we often see in Native American art. But the reaction to seeing the swastika is often quite strong amongst people. Next picture. So there's that first one. I heard a little laugh when some folks saw it. Very interesting what might be happening. But the reality is, if we look at that picture from a different perspective, this is what is happening. I suspect the 3 means 3 children. And we have a proud father in front of us, and not someone offering a gesture that is has obscene connotations to it. So in each of these instances, we had a reaction, and that reaction was very quick, and those reactions are symptomatic of our worldview at work.
Excellent. So Jerry's going to talk a little bit more about some of our reactions and where they come from in a little bit. But we thought we would take you right now to what are some of the worldview challenges that we're aware of and have been encountering in social and business environments. And these are just a few. The Worldview Framework came about actually 30 or 40 years ago, developed by a philosopher by the name of Leo Apostel. And at that point, he was noticing increasing fragmentation and polarization in the world. And certainly we're in a time now, 30 or 40 years later, where most of us feel this pretty significantly. We're also, very much aware, all of us, about the increasing globalization, and it means many things, but three that we've picked out are greater diversity in the workplace and in communities. Information access is instantaneous and, as we know, not always accurate. In the midst of more connectivity between people, there's a growing sense of isolation. And I just saw recently an article that said our young people are feeling this isolation the most. There's a higher profile of social issues, whether it's racism or poverty or concentration of wealth or any of those things. We're seeing much more of that. People are more vocal. The Me Too movement, the Never Again movement. And then we're also in the midst of a generational handoff from boomers to the millennials to the, in between there, the Gen X, and underneath of that, or next in line, the Gen Z, or whatever it is we're going to end up calling them. And so the question is, what does worldview have to do with this or with anything? And, what is a worldview? And one of our favorite quotes is from Anais Nin, where, we don't see things as they are, but we see them as we are. And so we see the world through our own worldview. This little picture, has to do with these fish who are swimming in the water. And it's a beautiful day, and as they're going along, an older fish swims by them and says to them, it's a beautiful day, how's the water? And they swim on by each other, and after a while, one fish looks at another fish and says, well, what's water? And our worldviews are like that. We're in them, we're swimming in them. They're all around us. We see through them, we think through them, but we're not really aware of them. And we often say that while we think with our worldviews, we don't often think about them. One of the things that Jerry and I and Nancy and Rolf were very aware of is the word worldview. Worldview is coming into greater use these days. We see it all of the time, and it's generally used to try to distill something down, something that's very complex, into something simple so that we can understand it. We see the word ascribed to people. They'll say a comment, they'll do one behavior or one action, and people will go, oh, that's their worldview, but we don't always really know, well, what does that mean? And we do this, like I said, to try to understand something that's very complex, but in making it simple, we often run into problems. So what is a worldview, and where does it come from? Our worldview really is the lens or the many lenses through which we see and experience the world. We're not born with a worldview, but we are born into worldviews, because not only do each of us individually have a worldview, but our families have worldviews, our communities have worldviews, our faith institutions, our schools, and we are assuming and adopting worldviews before we even know what's up. Our worldviews are socially and locally constructed, so where we're born, where we live, has an influence on our worldview, and the relationships that we have and the conversations that we have also have an influence on our worldview. Our worldviews influence the actions that we take in the world, and as we take action in the world, our worldviews, our actions give us feedback for our worldview, which may either reinforce the way that we see and experience the world, or may offer us the opportunity to ask questions about what we think our worldview is and whether or not we might want to change it. We do know that worldviews are changeable over time. For any of us, if we stop and reflect on how we see and experience the world now versus how we saw and experienced it when we were younger or had less experience in the world, we will realize that our worldviews change. It happens sometimes without our awareness, and the good part is if it happens without our awareness, then we can also be conscious and intentional about expanding our worldview or using that information to open exploratory conversations. The last thing I'll say about this is that our worldviews are very, very closely linked to our identity, and the The psychological research tells us that when our identity is threatened, we respond as if our very life is threatened. And then I'll just hand it over to Jerry for the next part. I can't hear you, Jerry.
Before Jerry takes the microphone, could we ask you all please to mute your microphone, because there is some background noise coming from different parts of Europe and the world. Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
And I think, Kathy, before we move on, we should just check to see if there are any questions that people might have about worldviews, where they come from, how we get them, so on.
And let me suggest, this is Nancy speaking, let me suggest that when you ask your questions, say just your first name, just so we know where the question's coming from. And remember to unmute or we won't hear you. Thanks.
Okay. If I'm looking at the chat box too. So, as Kathy mentioned, our worldviews and our personal identities, the sense of who we are very much connected to each other. And so, when our personal identity is threatened, we respond as if our very life is threatened. What happens is this influences then our behavior as individuals and our behavior as groups, our worldview behaviors or our general behaviors. And we're going to review a little bit some of the typical behaviors that we see and how they show up in worldview. So the first one is confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is our own tendency to only listen to or hear information that confirms what we already believe. So if we have an opinion about something, information that supports that opinion will be things that we hear, that bottom of the ladder of the inference. And things that don't support that opinion or view, we often don't hear. It does not register with us. We respond to things that confirm what we already believe. Next slide, please. Even more so is that we are, not only do we hear things that support us, our views, but we are actually motivated to look for information and find information that supports what we already believe. So this, in terms of our worldviews, we are actively looking for information that supports what we believe, supports our worldview. This is why it becomes so important to have an awareness of our worldview, because it is influencing actions here, actions of information gathering, actions of responses to circumstances. So we may respond to something because we're motivated to act in a way that agrees with something we already believe. Next slide, please. This is the law of group polarization. And what this means is that, in fact, when we believe something and we begin to associate with people that believe the same way that we do, and because we're motivated to, as we said earlier, we're motivated to associate with people or books or things that already agree with us. When we associate with people that agree with us, we actually become stronger in our views. And this is why the world is becoming increasingly polarized, is when we speak with someone, associate with someone who thinks the way we do, our views on that topic actually become stronger. So I don't know if this has happened to any of you, but there have been times when I've been in conversations with people that think like me, and I might find myself taking a position on the issue much stronger than I would in other circumstances. I know this happens to me on occasion in conversations about the environment, as I can get pretty strong in my feelings about the environment, and yet in a mixed group, I might not speak so strongly. And so not only are we motivated to find people that agree with us, when we do, our views on those things become much stronger, our worldviews. Next slide, please. This slide is something called cognitive dissonance. And the idea here is that our brains do not like to hold two ideas if they disagree with each other. So when we're asked to hold two ideas in disagreement with each other, to think about them, we become very uncomfortable. And as human beings, we don't like to be uncomfortable. So we begin to let go of the idea that disagrees with our thinking and stick with the idea that agrees with us. What happens then is we don't explore different sides of the same issue, because in doing that, we find some discomfort. So what we like to say, a worldview intelligence skill is the ability to hold two conflicting ideas at the same time, to think about them. Why are they different ideas? What is it about them where they might disagree or see things differently? How might that affect my view on things? And so the invitation is actually to sit a little bit in some of that discomfort as we begin to learn and explore other views and other opinions about things that are different than our own worldviews or ideas. Yeah. So that's a bit of brain science, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about how our worldview influences our behaviors out in the world, how we see the world around us, and how we respond to it before we move on. So any questions?
So I'll move on. I'm going to share with you right now the framework that we've been using with the 6 dimensions. And one of the things that you may be becoming aware of with the typical reactions and behaviors that Jerry just shared is there's an invitation to be curious about our own behaviors, what we look at, what we don't look at, as a way of beginning to think about how do we open an exploratory conversation for on a difficult topic or an issue that we might not be able to talk to someone else about. And the framework also does the same kind of thing. So the first invitation around the framework is, what is your own worldview? Where does it come from? And the second invitation really is to think also about, someone that you know, who maybe you have a different view from, or you think about some things differently, because as we go through the 6 dimensions, you could think about yourself, and you could also think about someone else who maybe you need to have a conversation with, or a group that you're aware of, because not only do we individually have worldviews, but our organizations have worldviews, our social systems, our communities, they all also have worldviews. Even our countries have overarching worldviews with many other individual aspects of worldview underneath of it. And I like to say we're multi-dimensional human beings, and when we want to simplify things, sometimes we just want we want to think about them from one slice. And so the first dimension for worldview is reality. And this is, what is my day-to-day reality? How do I live my life? What are my normal, natural, everyday experiences from the time I get up in the morning till the time I go to bed? Who do I live with, or do I live alone? Where do I work? How do I get to work? Do I travel? All of these are aspects of day-to-day reality. Another aspect of day-to-day reality is our socioeconomic status. Do I live in relative comfort? Am I rich? Do I live in poverty? How does that influence my experiences of the world? Skin color is another thing that will influence our day-to-day reality. As a white woman in my mid-50s, there's a lot of opportunities that are open to me, and a lot of normal mundane experiences that might not be so available to some good friends of mine who skin color might be brown or black or some other version of that. It makes a difference. Also, in terms of day-to-day reality, there's another aspect of it is what are my belief systems, or do I believe in a single deity? Do I believe in something different? What do I think about the goodness of people? Do I think people are basically good, or people are basically evil? What do I think about beauty or ugliness, and where does all of that come from? So what are the belief systems that guide my actions in my day-to-day reality? The next dimension is history. And history is this question of who or what has influenced how I have come to see and experience the world. Who are the people who have been influential? What are the situations? What are the places that I've been? What are the events that have happened? These could be events that have happened to me personally. These could be global events. Jerry and I right now are in the process of writing a paper about seismic social change, and it's come out of our conversations about his experiences as a child of the 60s and 70s, and all of the various things that influenced his worldview in that perspective. For me, when I think about history, I grew up in a small fishing town here in Nova Scotia, and that is part of my history. And my history has grown and changed over time as I've grown and went to university and moved away and got married and had kids and entered into some of the different work environments that I've been in and have had the opportunity to travel. So the things that influence our history are personal things that have happened to us, but could also be other things that have happened in the world. Could be books that we read or movies that we've watched that have had an impact on us. So the next dimension is future, and this is a question of how we think about the future, how we anticipate the future. Do we plan for the future? Do we just think it will unfold and evolve? Also, in terms of the future, are we excited about the future? Are we anxious about the future? Do we think that the future will be an extension of the past, or do we think that it will be or it needs to be very different than the past? I always say here in Nova Scotia, where I live, there's a dynamic tension about how we see the future. Some people want it to be an extension of the past, and some people see it as needing to be very different. And the major motivator around that is lifestyle. The next, Jerry, I think I'm going to have to get you to talk about this because I seem to be losing my voice here for a second.
Okay, thank you, Kathy. Take a pause and I'll carry on for a moment. So the next dimension is values. What are our personal values and how do they influence our worldview and our actions? So you can think of value as the root of evaluation. And so in essence, we are evaluating things through our value structure. I may ask you, do you have personal values? And you would say likely yes. And I might say, well, what are they? And our experience is people can name 2 or 3 and then they can't think of too many more. And then we might ask you, are your values very strong for you? Do you believe that there are sort of permanent values? And many people will say yes. And so we might ask you, well, is honesty an important value for you? And often people say yes. Then we might ask, is kindness an important value? And you might also say yes. And then we might say, well, if a friend asks you how their new haircut looks, and it doesn't look very good, are you honest or are you kind? And so while we may think our values are holding them quite strong, often they have some gray areas in them. And being aware of what our values are and how, which ones we hold strongly, which ones we might hold a little more lightly, how we might respond when values are conflicting becomes really important. This is often the area in our work where we find sort of the greatest level of diverse views on issues, and where oftentimes if there's some challenge in a conversation, it can be based in differences of values that people hold. Kathy, you want me to carry on or are you ready? Okay, so the next one are practices. And this is, what are the practices that we live our life by? And how are those practices in line with our values? So knowing our values is important because they can influence the practices that we live our life by. You try to practice a lot of kindness. You stop and talk to people in the grocery store for just a moment, to the person that's being the checkout. Do you try to be environmentally sensitive in your lives? I travel a lot, and so I try to balance that with being much more environmentally aware in my life. I have a small wind turbine on my property, for example, to generate electricity. And so what are those practices? One interesting thing is that how a person's practices show up often tells us about how true they are to their worldview. So someone might say, I believe in cooperation, I believe in collaboration, and then they might be your employer and they do everything with hierarchy. And so the practices don't reflect their stated values or worldviews. And we find that this is often an area where we can learn a lot about a person. And then the next one. And then lastly is knowledge. And this is that question of, how do we know what we know? So where does our information come from? Does it come from the newspaper, from the television, from social media? Do we trust science? Do we believe in science? Or does our information come from something else? Does it come from intuition or revelation? What are the sources of knowledge that we trust and value? Who do we trust and value in knowledge? And then finally, how do we know that our answers to all of these questions are true? How do we know that our thinking about our reality or our history, a sense of future, our values, our practices are true? Have we really taken the time to think about them carefully? So these are the 6 dimensions that we use to provide a framework to explore individual or professional or organizational or cultural, because cultures have worldviews.
Cool. So just one other thing that that I would add in here, certainly around knowledge, is one of the things that we talk about, and Jerry talked about it with the group polarization, is that we're often hanging out with people who think the same way that we do. And when we do that, we keep reinforcing our notion that our worldview is the right worldview. And depending on the sources of knowledge that we trust, what news stations you watch regularly or what newspapers you read, certain channels of information are very targeted towards certain worldviews. So if that's all you watch, then you begin to see how, or read, then you begin to see how polarization happens and becomes more entrenched, because we're more convinced that the way we see and experience the world is the right way. And one of the issues and challenges is that when we don't believe somebody else's experience or don't acknowledge it, then that's when we end up in a position of not being able to have a conversation, because there's no common ground or there's no exploratory ground to be able to shift that conversation. And Jerry mentioned around values, one of the things that we know is that facts don't work. Oftentimes we fall back to facts. The facts don't work in an argument, or they don't work to persuade someone, because in this age of information overflow, we can just go find our own flat facts that support our worldview, whether facts that we gather are accurate or not. So this is where we'll pause again just to see if there's any questions that are arising for people.
It's not a question, it's Lan speaking.
Yes.
It's not a question, it's just a reaction.
Please.
It's like when we see in all the 6 dimensions, it's like my reaction is like you put people in a machine. If we know all this, it's like a personal scan. It's the word that comes to me. So, you know everything about that person.
Thank you. And one thing important is these are not separate. They're interrelated. So our history influences our values, or our values might influence our practices, or how we experience life each day might influence how we think about the future. And so these are separate as for exploration, but interconnected as we are a whole person.
Yeah, here's Val. What I find so interesting about these is that they apply to the different levels. So to me as a person, but I've often, when I go through these, I think of my organization in particular.
Mm-hmm.
And what I find so interesting is that it fits for all the different sort of scales of entities, my personal entity, my family, my organization, or the society I live in. That's the one thing that fascinates me about the framework. The other one is, I would still be very curious, but you probably come to that, but still to see how I can work with that. For example, thinking of my organization, I see some of what you said about the disconnect between the values and the practice. How do you make this visible, and how do you work with that? How can you, or is making it visible already the first step to in the direction of alignment, maybe when it becomes aware, or what else? Thank you.
I think you're right, Val, in that the first step is awareness. And sometimes just that awareness enables people to work in that environment a little bit better, without getting into a lot of thoughtfulness around it. One of the challenges, of course, that comes up is when people aren't willing to see the disconnect between the practices and the values or reality, or between action and worldview. So lots more could be said there, but I don't know that we have how much time we have to go into that right now.
I wonder, Kathy, if we just go to the next slide and give some examples very quickly, that might be helpful of how it's used.
Yeah, okay. And then just the one thing that I would say is thank you for that reflection, Val, because this is one of the things that we're really enjoying about the Worldview Framework, is that it's so applicable in a variety of different contexts, individually, collectively, organizationally, professionally. It's part of what makes that framework so powerful in using it for the explorations.
So we've been fortunate to work with a number of different organizations or clients. Today we talked mainly about our own personal worldview, or how to explore another person's worldview, because these are starting points. We like to say, what's the starting point? When I come to a conversation, or someone else comes to a conversation, what is their starting point? But the same true for organizations. What is an organization's starting point for a conversation? And from that awareness, they can begin to think about where they might want to go, or if their relationship with others. So one of the organizations we work with is Sanford Health. It's a hospital organization, healthcare. Right now, they have 30,000 employees. They expect to double in size to about 60,000 within the next year. And they're doing this by acquiring other hospitals or other organizations. And what they're finding is there are very different worldviews in these mergers and acquisitions. And sometimes they've had problems when they haven't been aware of the differences and how to work with those differences. One example is they wanted to find uniformity across the system. They created a uniform reporting system. They thought it would be very helpful. Everybody else thought it was forced on them. Very different kinds of worldviews. How do you work with that? The Wilder Foundation is an organization working with poverty to help people in poverty. And as we worked with them to think about the various groups and the worldviews of the different groups they work with, they came to a realization that their worldview is there will always be poverty. It will never go away. So even though their purpose is to solve poverty, it will always be there. And that was a big impact on how the staff saw themselves and their work and their relation to the organization. The next two by each other, NJEA and MTA, are large labor unions. NJEA has about 200,000 members. It's education, so it's teachers, cooks, bus drivers, aid workers, everyone. And then MTA, Massachusetts Teachers Association, is mainly just teachers. It has about 100,000 members. Both organizations have operated for several years with one specific worldview, and now they need to change. So they need to shift from what we would call a service worldview to an organizing worldview. And part of this is happening because of an external event, a Supreme Court ruling that's about to change how they operate. And so they need to change the members' views. So in the case of Massachusetts, for example, how 100,000 people see their relationship to the union needs to change. And so they want to use a worldview approach to bring that to the conversations. So one is, what's the reality of the person I'm in conversation with? What's their history? Are they a teacher for 20 years? Or are they brand new? What are some of the values as they think about labor unions? And each of those things will influence the conversations that they have. And so that sort of analytical tool. The Barrister Society is another one that gone through a worldview change from being more of a regulatory enforcement body within the law profession to being one more of sort of helping and learning and improving and changing. And so it's you went from an enforcement to assistance in worldviews. And that required a whole shift amongst the staff. And then lastly, we've just been working with a group of young people, about age 18 to 22. They're Native American, and they are in a program that is sort of their last chance program in life for many of them to finish school and to acquire a skill. Many of them that we work with are homeless. Come from very difficult homes. Their parents might be in jail or somewhere. They've been in trouble with the law, and they're trying one last time to organize their life. And with Worldview, we help them develop a sense of personal value. I am a person of value, and my views can make a difference, and I don't have to see myself in such a negative light. And so this is more personal. And so those are examples of how Worldview Intelligence has been used in different organizations with different circumstances and different needs. And so maybe, Val, that's helpful a little bit, but we're also happy to answer any questions that you might have about how Worldview can be used. And Kathy, maybe you have something to add.
I'm good for now. Well, no, actually, I will say one thing. One of the things that is also great about the Worldview Intelligence Framework is that it's very responsive to different issues and inquiries. And so we don't have one set of workbooks that we draw off the shelf to implement with our clients, but we're able to take the framework and develop different reflection tools or different exercises for the clients based on what is the need that we're responding to, and what are the outcomes that they're looking for. So it's a very responsive, very adaptable framework that also has a lot of stickiness to it. I just was talking to a client here in Nova Scotia who said, I did one of the very first bits of Worldview work with them a couple of years ago, and I just bumped into him again, and he goes, that work that you did was really sticky. Like, it's the one thing we did that is still really applicable.
Great. So any questions or reflections, comments people might have about what you've just heard?
Yes, I have a question. I had a conversation some days ago with a manager about worldview intelligence and leadership skills. I would like to hear some words from you about that.
So one of the groups we've worked with had an internal leadership program, and they wanted Worldview Intelligence to be part of the leadership program, and so we brought it in. It's with innovation teams inside an organization. And the idea is that a leadership skill, an important leadership skill, is to know yourself, to know how you see the world, how you respond to circumstances. A second important leadership skill is to be able to understand and explore with curiosity how another person see a circumstance, might see what conflict exists or not exist, so on, so that you can move forward on difficult. We've used Worldview Intelligence for conflict resolution, for example, to help people see that they have a very different perspective, and so that it is a strong leadership skill, particularly around the intercommunications realm. Kathy?
Yeah, one thing that we say to people over and over again is you are your most powerful instrument. And so the more you know about yourself, how you see the world, what your starting point is, the more effective that you can be when you're working with other people in leadership, management, or facilitation kinds of capacities. And over again, when we do this work with clients, they will say that personal worldview exploration is fundamentally important, and I see it now even more than I knew it before.
So I have a question. This is Nancy. Oh, perfect timing. I was just going to ask you, what is your intention on the 3 days of the European Worldview programs that you'll be doing? Here we are.
So, so the overall intention, well, first of all, is we get to work with the most amazing people, with Nancy and Rolf, and with our colleague Stefan in Geneva. And so that's really good. And we're doing this to introduce Worldview more fully into European places, cities and workplaces. And the intent for people who come is to have a greater understanding about worldviews and where they come from, to go deeper than we did in this short period of time. Have people begin to understand why knowing about worldviews gives them a strategic advantage, and then to have some opportunity to apply the framework and some of the other things that we share to some actual situations, to begin to think about what's that conversation I need to have, what's that change I want to make in the organization, what's that team, what are the teams we need to bring together, just so that there is a practical piece and is useful to people as well, so that you'll walk away with information and also application.
So Kathy, just to be clear, that means that at the end of these days, people will be able to put something in their toolbox, so to speak?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interactive, and we share information, we invite reflection, we invite small group conversations, and we invite that exploration around how to make this useful.
Lance speaking, I have a question.
Yes.
So again, I don't know, but it's the, the Worldview Intelligence remind me a lot about the image theory of connect bonding. Do you know about that, and how do you make that connection?
I didn't quite catch the last part of what you said. I made the connection with image theory of connect bonding, and you know about that, and then how do you see the connection between the two? I don't really know about it.
Okay.
But one of the things that we're aware of is that people with a lot of background in different methodologies or different approaches see how worldview aligns with those approaches, and also sees where worldview can enhance the use of other approaches as well.
Okay.
Kathy and Jerry, can I suggest that we come back on the screen of everyone's faces so we can, hear questions and look at people raising their hand, but you don't need to, just unmute your mic and speak up if you'd like to.
So if there are other questions, we're happy to answer them.
Okay. If we have not more questions now in this virtual space, please don't hesitate to write your questions. You will get an answer for sure. And please don't hesitate to visit us in May at the 3 points where it's possible, in Geneva, in Paris, and in Cologne. We would be happy to see you. So if we still have no question, I guess it's my part to say thank you very much for your attendance, and we're happy to have you here as guests, and would like to see you again. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Rolf, I would just add that people can sign up to the website and get on our mailing list if they want to stay in touch. And also there's Worldview Intelligence Facebook group that is becoming more active over time.
Hi, it's Tina here. Did you see there's a question in the chat?
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
I also had another question, but I can wait until you speak.
So, Astrid, if you could write your question in the chat box, then we'll answer it for you.
It's there already.
Oh, sorry.
She would like to know if we've ever applied the Worldview Intelligence in organizations with regard to diversity management. One of the groups that we have worked with is the Diversity and Inclusion Department here in Halifax at HRM. And in particular, the leader of that department, but also she's had her whole team go through this, has talked about how the Worldview Intelligence approach really expands her way of thinking about her diversity and inclusion work. As sort of a brief answer. I don't know, Jerry, if you have anything else that you wanted to add to that.
I have to see if I'm. Yes, we have in particular a colleague that we work with that does a lot of diversity work, and he brings the Worldview Intelligence into he's African American. He's brought into a lot of organizations to do diversity work, and he finds a Worldview Intelligence approach much more effective than anything else that he's using because it really invites us. It doesn't just tell us that we might have opinions that could be, that are racist or sexist or some other negative view of someone else. It invites us to explore, where did that come from? How did we come to see the world the way that we did? And that's a very different exploration than someone telling us what is behavior that's inappropriate in a diverse environment. So, you know, we've had, and one other thing sort of related to that is we've done a fair amount of work with high school counselors. And one of the awarenesses for them was that as they worked with these students, they were interpreting the students' behavior through their own worldview, their own lens, often a lens of privilege, as opposed to seeing the students' behavior within the student's life or worldview or experience. And that awareness had a big impact for many of the counselors in how they've interacted with the students.
Jerry and Kathy, I want to bring your attention to two other questions that are in the chat box.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
How do you use have you used it in conflict situation? And if so, how?
Oh, yeah. Yes. So one of the things in conflict situations is that by talking about a person's worldview, we move it away from personal. So it's not about Kathy, it's about how Kathy's experiences or worldview influences her actions. And so we can talk about then not Kathy in the negative sense personally, but we can talk about Kathy's experiences. That's her worldview. That's how she sees this situation. Let's explore that more than a direct personal attack on Kathy. So we've had good success in conflict situations using a different approach, moving it away from the person as an individual and moving it into how they see the world around them and how that influences how they act.
Yeah, and I would just add that people have naturally adopted the language once they become exposed to it of worldview, and then they begin to incorporate it into their language. And we also do stuff around why am I reacting the way that I am, or why are we reacting the way that we are, and then how do we expand that? And there's a range of other approaches that we could bring to it as well.
Tina, can I ask something?
Yeah.
Yeah. So just following on from that, sorry, it's a bit dark here. Yeah, so I'm hearing a lot that it's a lot also about empathy. Is that right? Is that what happens with people? Because I guess let's say the word worldview could also be, let's say, as we use it in normal language, no, which can also be something that if you don't have the empathy, it can push you apart, right? So you're like going, oh my God, I just realized what worldview they have, you know, and their view of humans is like so, and this is like, it can, you know, or yeah, and especially with history or whatever, you totally understand, but you can also there can also be this feeling of like, how can we ever find common ground? Because if we're talking about our gardens, I know that there's all these concepts and values that they have about why they do these things and control, da 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 da. But I'm hearing from you that in your process work that people will experience and possibly learn from you how that can be used to create empathy. Is that right? I'm sort of, you know, I'm trying to reflect about, so you could sort of, you know, if I'm a bit provocative, I could say, duh, yeah, we got different worldviews, and now what? You know, how does that bring us together and not push us apart?
Yeah, you were bang on. Maybe Jerry will say something about empathy in a moment, because we do talk about that. The one thing that I would say to your point, and it comes up over and over again, is that when we find points of connection with people, then we can explore the differences that we have from a very different perspective and a different orientation. And we always say when we start with difference, we amplify the difference. When we start with connection and create a relationship, more things become possible.
Yes, thank you, Tina, and that's very true. We view empathy as the effort to understand how someone came to see world the way they did, and empathy is different than sympathy. So we don't have to agree with their worldview, but we may want to understand how they came to see things the way they are. Rolf, that's a bit of a leadership skill also, is working with people with different worldviews in the world of curiosity and understanding, and not in the world of judgment. And yet, even then, there are some worldviews that exist out there that it's very difficult for me to be empathetic with, to really understand. But at least I have some structure to explore how they came to see the world the way that they did, and where there might be connection for further conversation, and where we just might not be able to be in conversation. So empathy is an important part here. We have not, the note from Karen, we have not used it with, we've used it with high school students, definitely. We've not used it with students younger, but I think, it would strike me as there isn't any reason why, with care in language, so that young people, elementary students, you're within their language skills, that you couldn't use it to begin to explore what their experiences are, their daily experiences, their reality, to understand each other better. So I think that's an important thing for us to reflect on.
The new question that just showed up in the chat box from Cecile around ways to use this approach to work on each other's alignment is in the logical levels. I'm not so familiar with the logical levels, but one of the things that we do talk about a fair bit, and what we experience in the worldview, is that becoming aware of the starting point. So alignment happens between individuals, but also like within a department or across an organization, depending on what we're working on. And this kind of exploration just enables people, again, to make those connections, but also to see where the work needs to be done. And with a number of clients that we've been working with, they've been discovering silos and communication challenges, and this question of, we don't know what each other does. And so, some of these are pretty elementary that you could do with almost any kind of approach or framework, and the Worldview Intelligence approach gives us some really good tools and concepts to work with.
I see there's also a question from Rosa.
Mm-hmm.
She would like to hear something about the experiential aspects of the work.
So we've been building more and more of that into our work as we go along, but just, I think there's a couple of ways that we approach it, but one is from some systems thinking tools or exercises where we help people begin to see their thinking, or how automatic it is, and how to break some of those typical ways of thinking. So exercises with the group that illuminate it, and we have like physical movement things that we do with people. The first one off the top of my head is just having people make connections by asking a series of questions and seeing who identifies. If we're standing in a circle, and if you identify with the question, you step in, or the statement, and if you don't, you stay back. And we offer a series of questions that can be very general or very tailored to the group that we're working with, to begin to get an understanding of different aspects of people, or of different views. There's a host of them that we've been using recently.
If I could add to that, I was lucky enough just 2 weeks ago to be present when Kathy and Jerry delivered a day program to the Massachusetts Teachers Association. And it was really valuable to see the degree to which all the 20 participants were like those 3 fish in a bowl. They had never taken the time to look at this. And at the end of the day, they really did see that we act through our worldviews and we use our worldviews, but we just never talk about them. And to see the degree to which their worldviews impact on where they enter into a conversation or a decision-making process or anything, it was really very powerful. And they did this with lightness and joy, but also a lot of learning. At one point when Kathy and Jerry had them speak in small groups and talk about their worldviews, when they came back in plenary, Kathy said, "So, let's hear from you." And one guy said, "My worldviews are right." He'd understood the impact that worldviews have on how we are in conversation.
And I'd like to come to a question, I think, from Astrid around foreign employees and refugees, and just speak a moment to we've done a fair amount of work around cultural worldviews because they can be very different, and how the difference in cultural worldviews can impact interpretation of behaviors and people working together. One that shows up pretty often is the difference between an individualistic society and worldview and more of a collectivist. And so if for those of us that come from European backgrounds, we've been very influenced by this individualistic view of things. We celebrate individual success. We celebrate individual achievement. The individual takes precedence over the group. And it's very much a function of the Enlightenment and what's happened subsequently. But there are many cultures where the group is more important than the individual. And so individual success is measured by the success of the group as a whole. And this can often create conflicts in work teams. And certainly it creates conflict in education systems. This was one of the great challenges that was so destructive with Native Americans in the US is they came from a collectivist culture. And when they would go to the classroom and try to work as a team, they were punished for it because they were supposed to work as individuals. And so that's one element, and there are other elements of cultural experience and how they influence how people can interact with each other in the workplace, socially, elsewhere. And that was one of the big ahas for the high school counselors we worked with, was this sort of cultural impact on how they saw the students and how they were not seeing the students in their own cultural or social world. The last thing I would mention is the realization that many people have to live in more than one culture. So you might come and work in the dominant white culture and go home and live in another culture. And so some people have to live in a multiple of cultures, and even understanding that and being aware of that can impact how we communicate with each other.
Are there any other comments or questions or reactions? Or even if you just want to say one word, a thank you before we all leave one another, it's 9:15 and it's been a lovely chat. We've been so pleased to have so many people step in and so many people stay on.
So thank you very much. I have to go, and I will be it will be nice if I can come on the 18 in Paris, but I try to see my agenda, and I will talk to this kind of, to Philippe, Jean-Philippe. Okay. Sorry, my English is not very good. Ciao, thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Yeah, thank you to all of you for your presence, for your questions. A lot of questions, a lot of inspiring questions came up. Great. It's also for us, nourishing, also for the day to design the days in Paris, in Geneva, and Cologne. Thank you very much.
Hope to see some of you again. Bye-bye.
A bientôt.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Much appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good to see you,
Bye,
Val.
Val. Bye, Val.
And so
Bye.
I stop the recording. Going to stop it.